August 17th, 1945. This week, Japanese Emperor Hirohito announces the Japanese surrender. But the war continues. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week was a week of earth-shaking events. The Americans dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, destroying large parts of both and killing over 100,000 Japanese with just 2 airplanes. And the Soviets invaded Manchuria with 1.5 million men. There was still some resistance in the Japanese government on whether to accept the Allies' unconditional surrender demand or not, but Emperor Hirohito said they were, in fact, going to surrender, which they do this week. On the 14th, Hirohito records a radio message to be broadcast the next day to the people of Japan, telling them of the surrender. But it might not be so simple. That night, a group of Japanese army officers, with a whole lot of troops, attacked the palace to try to steal the recording to prevent its broadcast. But palace guards foil this. The coup leader is Kenji Hatanaka, who commits suicide when it fails. And this is the Kyujo incident, an attempted military coup by the staff office of the Ministry of War. Now, late on the 12th, several officers speak to War Minister Kurashika Anami and ask him to do whatever it takes to not accept the Potsdam Declaration. That's where the Allied demand for unconditional surrender comes from. Anami refuses to say whether he will assist them in committing treason. However, the night of the 13th, Anami twice expresses opposition to surrendering, one of those times to the Army Chief of Staff. Then, Masahiko Takeshita, not just one of the coup plotters, but also Anami's brother-in-law, suggests Anami resign, which would topple the government, and then support the coup. Anami says resigning won't stop an imperial edict, and as for the coup, he must first go to the Ministry of War. When he's there, he announces he will comply with the edict. In fact, all the senior officers there sign an agreement to back Hirohito's decision to surrender. Well, Hatanaka's guys get things going anyway around 9:30 the 14th. See, he's figured that just occupying the palace and showing rebellion will inspire the army to join him. So around 1 a.m., he and his rebels surround it. Some of them go into Takeshi Mori's office. He commands the 1st Imperial Guards Division, and his cooperation is vital for success this night. He refuses, though, so Hatanaka kills him to at least prevent him from ordering the division to stop the rebellion. They disarm the palace police and lock the doors, and then spend hours trying to find the recording of the surrender speech and the 2 men guarding it. They do not find it or them. Already by 3 a.m., though, Hatanaka gets word that the Eastern District Army is on its way to the palace to stop him, and he should give up. He asks that army's chief of staff if he can at least have 10 minutes on the air to explain to the Japanese people what he's trying to do. He is refused. Long story short, the rebellion is dismantled by the morning, and Hatanaka has left the premises. He kills himself around 11 a.m. His gang has also sent a group of rebels to Prime Minister Suzuki's office the night of the 14th to murder him, but he is warned and gets out of there minutes in advance. They do set the building on fire and Suzuki's home, but he is physically okay. The plotters failed in their attempt to overthrow the government. It was a close call, and in a way shows that the earlier fears of the peace advocates within the government, that any open move to end the war could lead to a coup which would prolong rather than shorten the conflict, was warranted. But the emperor, who had assured himself of backing from the imperial family, was able to assert his will against those who still refused to contemplate surrender. War Minister Anami actually kills himself the night of the 14th, by the way. So, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's recording is broadcast announcing the surrender of Japan. VJ Day is celebrated worldwide. This is apparently the first time the Japanese people have ever heard their emperor's voice. This is what the recording says. To our good and loyal subjects, after pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. We have ordered our government to communicate to the governments of the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union that our empire accepts the provisions of their joint declaration. To strive for the common prosperity and happiness of all nations, as well as the security and well-being of our subjects, is the solemn obligation which has been handed down by our imperial ancestors and which lies close to our heart. Indeed, we declared war on America and Britain out of our sincere desire to ensure Japan's self-preservation and the stabilization of East Asia, it being far from our thought either to infringe upon the sovereignty of other nations or to embark upon territorial aggrandizement. But now the war has lasted for nearly 4 years. Despite the best that has been done by everyone, the gallant fighting of the military and naval forces, the diligence and assiduity of our servants of the state, and the devoted service of our 100 million people, the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. Such being the case, how are we to save the millions of our subjects, or to atone ourselves before the hallowed spirits of our imperial ancestors? This is the reason why we have ordered the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of the Powers. We cannot but express the deepest sense of regret to our allied nations of East Asia, who have consistently cooperated with the Empire towards the emancipation of East Asia. The thought of those officers and men, as well as others who have fallen in the fields of battle, those who died at their posts of duty, or those who met with untimely death, and all their bereaved families, pains our heart night and day. The welfare of the wounded and the war sufferers, and of those who have lost their homes and livelihood, are the objects of our profound solicitude. The hardships and sufferings to which our nation is to be subjected hereafter will be certainly great. We are keenly aware of the inmost feelings of all of you, our subjects. However, it is according to the dictates of time and fate that we have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. Having been able to safeguard and maintain the COUP, we are always with you, our good and loyal subjects, relying upon your sincerity and integrity. Beware most strictly of any outbursts of emotion which may engender needless complications, or any fraternal contention and strife which may create confusion, lead you astray, and cause you to lose the confidence of the world. Let the entire nation continue as one family, from generation to generation, ever firm in its faith in the imperishability of its sacred land, and mindful of its heavy burden of responsibility and of the long road before it. Unite your total strength to be devoted to construction for the future. Cultivate the ways of rectitude. Foster nobility of spirit and work with resolution so that you may enhance the innate glory of the imperial state and keep pace with the progress of the world. Many of the Japanese people are shocked. Because of the government's tight control of the release of information about the war, they didn't know it was going so badly. On the 16th, Hirohito issues the imperial rescript ordering Japanese forces to cease fire. That day, Prince Norukiko Higashikuni forms a new government. Today, as the week ends, General Order Number 1 for Japan's surrender is prepared by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and signed by President Harry Truman. The surrender is received differently in different places. On the 15th in China, Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek broadcasts, "Our faith in justice through the bleak and hopeless days of 8 long years of struggle has been rewarded." It's true. They've been fighting the Japanese since July 1937. There's also big news from China this week, though. On the 14th, a new Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Alliance is signed between Joseph Stalin's USSR and Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist China. I have much to say about this, and we'll talk about this next week. I have other China stuff to talk about now. On the 15th, Douglas MacArthur, commander of all U.S. Pacific Area Army Forces, issues the order to the Japanese that the Japanese in China can only surrender to the Chinese nationalists, not Mao Zedong's Chinese communists. The next day, the 16th, Communist Army Commander Zhu De sends a note to the British, Soviet, and American embassies in Chongqing, the Chinese nationalist capital. It first lists all the accomplishments of the Chinese communists during the war, and its size, over 1 million regular troops and 2.2 million militia, and then says, they have earned the right to accept the surrender of Japanese forces, ostensibly about a single issue, the taking of the Japanese surrender. It had enormous implications because the party that took the surrender of the Japanese troops got the weapons and the territory they controlled, both of which translated into strength in the looming civil conflict in China. The subtext of Zhu's message made clear the communist view of themselves. They were not simply an armed party. They were a legitimate alternative government of China, the government of about 1/4 of the country's total population. And even in just the hours after the Japanese surrender, they are sending guerrillas into areas that are likely soon to be contested by them and the nationalists to have first boots on the ground. The nationalists do the same, but the communist forces have a real geographical advantage. But the Allies agreeing with Zhu's position, or just staying out of things altogether, could maybe pretty quickly lead to a communist China north of the Yellow River and a KMT, nationalist, one south of it. U.S. Ambassador to China Patrick Hurley says to reject Zhu's claim, as he thinks agreeing to it would provoke an immediate civil war. He trusts the Soviets and the New Deal with Chiang. Zhu gets a reply that rejects his claim, and the communists cannot accept Japanese surrenders. Here's the thing though, the Chinese communists do control big chunks of northern China. And all throughout the war, they've been setting up peasant organizations behind enemy lines, and parallel governments even. And those millions of soldiers and militia are already in many places under either Japanese or puppet control. And the KMT has a military presence in those areas of pretty much zero. Hence the directive to surrender only to the nationalists. Tricky situation. As for northern China, the Japanese in Manchuria receive word of the surrender broadcast, of course, but their Kwantung army commander rescinds the surrender order. They do get formal directions today to arrange a ceasefire, but the active war has gone on there all week long, trying to fight off the invading Soviet Red Army. Here's quite a good and long quote from William Heastan's Soviet Tanks in Manchuria, 1945. By 1944 and 45, the Soviets had refined their approach to offensive operations. Typically, a major offensive would be conducted by multiple fronts, with special representatives from the general staff, such as Zhukov or Vasilevsky, sent from Moscow to coordinate. The fronts would attack with their combined arms armies, breaking through enemy defenses with a heavy artillery barrage, followed by infantry assault supported by SPGs and heavy tank regiments. Some armies were designated shock armies due to particularly heavy augmentation with artillery and mechanized assets. Tank armies were positioned in the second echelon behind the attacking forces to quickly exploit breakthroughs in the enemy front. Second echelon forces were not reserves in the Western sense, but positioned by the first wave to develop the attack. With the enemy front line broken, the second echelon exploitation formations would drive deep into enemy rear areas to shatter the defenses, seize key objectives, and envelop enemy units. The Soviets paid great attention to doctrine for pursuit operations and meeting engagements. Tank and mechanized corps led the advance, with light reconnaissance elements ahead and on the flanks, and powerful forward detachments typically built around a reinforced tank brigade, led the main columns and brushed aside any light resistance. If a major enemy force was encountered, the advanced detachment would engage and pin it in place so the following main body could maneuver and strike it from the flank. There you have it. The fight here over the huge area that is Manchuria means Soviet tanks and SPGs, self-propelled guns, are going to really be at the forefront for long-range maneuvers. The Japanese have planned for delaying actions and then making a stand along the Korea-Manchuria border in a defensive zone there. They have some flaws in their planning. For example, they don't think the Mongolian desert or Khingan Mountains are passable by the larger Soviet units, so they're not defending there. And they have one division each guarding the two railway corridors. However, Rodion Malinovsky's Trans-Baikal Front is attacking across the desert and the mountains with fully half the Soviet combat power of the whole offensive. Andrei Kravchenko's Sixth Guards Tank Army is their primary attack force. In spite of the desert terrain and the heat, they crossed it and reached the foothills already last week on the 9th, the first day of operations. The mountain trails can have gradients of up to 30 degrees though, so the engineers are now hard at work. In the first 3 days of the offensive, that tank army advances 350 kilometers, but heavy rains mean that supply trucks could not advance into the mountains, and the armor has to stop because they don't have gas. So, 400 planes fly in fuel in 160 or so sorties a day, and by the 15th, the armored columns are moving once again. They have completely upended the Japanese defense, even though they haven't met that much actual resistance. Japanese 3rd Area Army Commander Jun Ushiroku has ordered his forces to pull back to Mukden to defend their families and the local Japanese civilians. He does send in airstrikes against the advancing Soviets, but they do little damage. Aside from Malinovsky's main thrust, he has a Soviet-Mongolian group attacking further south, while 39th and 36th armies attack in the north to pin down the Japanese in the railway corridors. 36 spends all week attacking the Hayalar fortified zone, and 39th isolates the Wuchaku fortified zone and sends force streaming past it. Kirill Meretskov's First Far Eastern Front faces more formidable prepared defenses and fortifications. They advanced quickly from the get-go, tearing a hole in the enemy front, and by the 11th, they're advancing on Mutanchang, the gateway to the Central Plains. The Japanese resistance here is stiff, but by the time Mutanchang falls, the Japanese report losses of over 20,000 in the fight for it, but possibly tens of thousands of more, and claim they have inflicted 7,000 to 10,000 Soviet losses. The Soviet 35th Army to the north faces tougher terrain and Huto Fortress, with a 240mm railway gun and a 410mm howitzer. This holds out until the end of the week. Harbin, where the Japanese have conducted biological and chemical warfare development, is a target of Maxim Perkayev's Second Far Eastern Front's supporting attacks. They use the Amur River flotilla to cross that river and flank the Japanese positions. As the week nears its end, the Japanese positions begin surrendering. This front does face pretty intense resistance on Sakhalin Island. The Soviet offensive begins the 11th, but develops into a series of failed frontal attacks. It is renewed the 16th, and small-scale amphibious attacks are planned for the coming days to break the stalemate. As for the Korean Peninsula, the Soviet 25th Army enters it, and amphibious attacks the 11th and 12th face no resistance, but landings the 13th at Chongjin are pinned down, and it isn't until the 16th that Chongjin is cleared. There's fighting going on in other Japanese-occupied territory. On the 15th in Vietnam, the August Revolution begins. Now, the Viet Minh, who originally fought against the French, have waged a guerrilla war against the Japanese occupiers, okay? They are a national independence coalition formed and led by the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. The point of the Viet Minh was to gain broader support than the communists could on their own. This year, 1945, they have been supported to a certain extent by the American OSS, the Foreign Intelligence Agency. Ho Chi Minh actually began all this when he created the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League in 1925. In 1930 in Hong Kong, the Vietnamese Communist Party was created with him as chairman. And later that year, the name was changed to the Indo-Chinese Communist Party by a Comintern directive. In 1941, Ho Chi Minh formed the Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam, called Viet Minh for short. The anti-colonial movement in Indochina has been dominated by the communists in the north, but has been more complicated in the south. Back in March, the French government here was ousted by the Japanese, and Bao Dai became Vietnamese emperor, with the Japanese ruling through him and the Tran Trong Kim cabinet. But a famine this spring and summer helped precipitate a crisis of authority. Now, in our War Against Humanity series, we have an episode about that famine which has either just come out or will quite soon, so check that out for details. But neither the Japanese nor the French did much to alleviate it, though they did a fair amount to help cause it. And the Tran Trong Kim cabinet could not do anything without Japanese consent. So while the famine drove a lot of hungry people into the cities, it also politicized a lot of the younger generation, which the Viet Minh used. They heavily talked up the impotence of the government, stoked anti-colonial fires, and even raided the Vietnamese landlords' granaries to feed the people. And all over the north, they created People's Revolutionary Committees. See, last month at Potsdam, the Allies agreed to split Indochina into two zones at the 16th parallel, with the South going to Southeast Asia Command, and with Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalists dealing with the North. And when the Japanese announced their surrender the 15th, the Viet Minh immediately launched the insurrection they've been preparing. And even in these first couple days, the Japanese are sort of standing by while the Viet Minh begin to take control. As I said, the August Revolution has begun. But this week of the war is over. Another momentous one, with Emperor Hirohito announcing Japanese surrender. A coup attempt to prevent the announcement. Celebrations all over the world, well, except in places like Manchuria, where the Soviets have sent in a massive invasion army, and Vietnam, where a revolution has begun. There is also this. On the 17th, the Republic of Indonesia declares itself independent of the Dutch. We did a whole mini-series on the Indonesian War for Independence that now begins. A link for that is at the end. So, the war should be over with Hirohito's broadcast, right? But it's not. A little trouble is brewing in Big China, and tens of thousands of men are killed in the active fighting in Manchuria after the surrender, after the troops know that the war is supposed to be over. In Indonesia and Vietnam, it's the same thing. The war is over, but the war is not over. And when? When will it really be over? Nobody knows. Back to 2024. In Indonesia, the new war ends in 1949, and you can see that brilliant 5-episode year-by-year miniseries we did on it on our Time Ghost History channel right here. It is really one of my favorites. It's brilliant, right, Sparty?
Absolutely.
Really, it's one of the best things we've ever done.
Great as well.
What?
You look great as well.
And I look great as well. Okay. It is the Time Ghost Army that is responsible for that series and this one. That is what keeps us going. So for ever more stuff like this, join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Wyatt Heller is the Army Member of the Week, and these are the newest Army officers. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.